Hey, welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be going through two arguments against what is known as the status argument made for the justification of eternal conscious torment. Eternal conscious torment is going to be referred to as ECT, and eternal conscious torment just means the kind of the traditional notion of hell as just a condition of eternal conscious torment, therefore ECT. So, the status argument is often deployed, and the point is to justify the necessity of ECT as the only condition where divine justice prevails. I assume that everyone wants divine justice to prevail. After all, it is divine justice that's kind of baked into the nature of it that it necessarily must prevail. So the universalist, me, person who believes in universal salvation, does not reject that divine justice must obtain. We reject that ECT will give you divine justice. So I'm going to recreate the status argument as follows. I'm going to be kind of throwing. This is a philosophical argument, so it's going to require paying attention and maybe even making notes, because I'm going to give you a logical syllogism. And so, suppose there is an entity that is of infinite value. We can refer to this entity as G. Suppose there is an entity that is of finite value. We can refer to this entity as H. Suppose that H offends G in some sort of way. By nature of the infinite value of G and the finite value of H, H has a debt that is infinitely great. A debt that is infinitely great can only be justly repaid by a punishment of infinite length that corresponds to the infinite value of the entity offended. A punishment of infinite length, in virtue of its infinite length, will never end. Thus, in order to procure necessary justice, H must be subject to a punishment of infinite length. Let us now rephrase this argument with some more familiar terms. If a human offends God, in virtue of a human's finite value and God's infinite value, the human must undergo an infinitely long punishment. In Christianity, we call this punishment eternal hell. So, this is from my book, so I'm just reading it off. So, I'm going to kind of go over, we're going to hit up two arguments. So, the first one is going to directly question whether or not necessary justice can obtain in hell. So again, the argument is that divine justice must obtain because humans are of finite value, God is of infinite value. If a being of finite value offends a being of infinite value, then that being of finite value, due to the correspondence of the values, must have an infinitely long punishment. An infinitely long punishment is the only way that the necessary divine justice will obtain. So, my argument. Suppose there is a person P in hell for whatever reason. At any temporal moment during P's stay in hell, there is always more of the sentence to be carried out. This is by nature of hell's infinite temporal length. If necessary of justice is obtained by P serving their sentence, but their sentence is infinitely long, then necessary justice is never obtained. No matter how many successive temporal moments have passed since P arrived in hell, there is never an infinite number of successive temporal moments. 1,000,000 years can pass, and there is still never a sentence served that is of an infinite length. 10,000,000 years can pass, and there is still never a sentence served that is of an infinite length. 1 quintillion years can pass, and there is still never a sentence served that is of an infinite length. The actual infinity always and will forever remain a potential infinity. Since an actual infinite length of a sentence served is never obtained, necessary divine justice is likewise never obtained. Thus, the eternal conscious torture model, adopted by many infernalists, never achieves necessary divine justice. If the purpose of the model is to ensure necessary divine justice, the model has absolutely failed. If the infernalists really desired to ensure necessary divine justice, they have two approaches. They have universal reconciliation or they have annihilationism. there must be an end to punishment that ends either in the reconciliation of all people to constitute necessary divine justice, or an annihilation of the damned before the eschaton that constitutes necessary divine justice. From this argument alone, I cannot argue you to the position of universalism, but I can argue you against the necessity of eternal conscious torment. Again, eternal conscious torment, by nature of it being of an infinite length, will never ensure a necessary divine justice, because there is always more of that potential infinity to be carried out. If your argument is that necessary divine justice can only be prevailed through an infinite punishment, you have contradicted yourself and derailed your own argument, because that is impossible by nature of what a infinite punishment constitutes, namely an unending punishment. Therefore, ECT, eternal conscious torment, cannot obtain necessary divine justice. Again, this leaves you with two options. You have annihilationism, annihilation of the damned. You have universalism. So I don't have an argument for universalism out of this, but what I do have is a pushback against the traditionalist notion of hell. Let us suppose another argument. This argument is the argument from original sin, right? So, actually, we'll do a different argument, because original sin isn't accepted by Orthodox, and so while that argument would have to be addressed by Protestants and Roman Catholics, I'm also speaking to Orthodox here, so let's do an argument that will also impact Orthodox arguments. So, let's call this the argument from value correspondence, right? So, the argument for value correspondence basically is that I'm going to argue that that we cannot base the nature of what constitutes punishment off of the person offended, or off of the entity offended, that being God in this sense, right? So the argument is that we cannot base the punishment off of the value of the entity offended. So I'm going to use a couple of terms here. I'll explain them. So if committing a general sin before God constitutes an infinite level of offense towards God, then after committing my first general offense as a child, I am now viewed in God's eyes, metaphorically, to be just as infinitely wicked and guilty as a serial killer. The offense made by a being with finite value towards a being with infinite value is the same in both cases. Sure, one of them may seem to be worse of an offense, but hey, you shouldn't let emotions cloud your judgment, you silly universalist. If we base the reason for eternal conscious torment on the fact that a being of finite value has offended a being of infinite value, the argument entails this conclusion, right? But this is atrocious. This violates all grounds of intuition and violates our basic moral sensibilities to the extent that it causes what we might call moral outrage. The seriousness of a sin cannot be determined along the lines only of who the sin offends. We cannot determine the seriousness of the sin and thus the seriousness of the punishment based on who the sin offends. The value correspondence does not the domain of value correspondence does not cover the necessary conditions of what punishment would entail. The seriousness of a sin, on the contrary, should take into account the nature of the sin itself. This can be the intent of the person who committed the sin, the character of that person, the effects of the sin, etc. Because we have pushed aside simply the notion that value correspondence is enough to obtain the necessary the necessary entailments for eternal conscious torment, a finite creature simply does not deserve an infinite punishment because they are finite and the victim is infinite, the victim being God. Now, suppose we even bite the bullet. The infernalist is like, I don't care about intuition. I don't care about moral outrage. I'm psychotic, right? They're psychotic. They're crazy. So they go, I don't care, I think that it's actually, yes, a child who commits their first sin is the same exact value towards God as a serial killer who rapes and murders 50 women. That's, what if someone accepts that? Well, this seems super unbiblical as well. So even if you accept this, so let's take Romans 3:23, right, which basically says more or less that all are sinners, right? So if all are sinners and sin itself, each sin constitutes an infinite value towards the being offended, which is God, then that means that all of us have an infinite level of wickedness towards God. This just seems, again, utterly intuitive. So now if you bite this bullet, you're now biting a philosophical bullet, you're biting a biblical bullet, and I mean, it's just, at this point, it's laughable. This is an absurd conclusion, right? Of course, the value correspondence alone cannot be what we think obtains the necessary entailments for a punishment, right? You must take into account the intent, the character of the person, and the effects. Now, all of this does not get us to universalism. All of this does not even get us past eternal conscious torment in a sense, right? But it completely goes against the status argument, the argument that I made at the beginning. Surely this argument deconstructs that argument, because the entailments of that argument would say that no, it's actually totally fine for God to view a small child who commits their first sin the same as a serial killer who rapes and murders 50 women, right? So this is clearly an absurd conclusion, and therefore the status argument is an absurd argument because it entails absurd conclusions. If we then double back to that argument that I made before, where quite literally you cannot get justice from an infinitely conscious punishment because of its infinite nature, then this further deconstructs the status argument. But that first argument, the necessary divine justice argument, actually hits to the core of the infernalist position. One of their points, free will is the other one, but we can do that in another episode. The point is that the necessary divine justice entails a being to suffer for the purpose of to suffer infinitely in order to correspond to the value of the entity that is offended, right? But if justice can ever be obtained due to the infinite nature of a length of punishment, then that argument entirely falls flat on its face. The infernalist looks foolish, as always, and universalism and annihilationism are your two alternatives. Annihilationism will be addressed in another video, as I still have to write some good arguments on that, but I have more stuff I could say on infernalism to do with free will, and to respond to some other objections concerning the character of the offender. As well, there's this really, really stupid argument called the continuing sin thesis, which says that humans will continue sinning internally in hell, which justifies God's keeping them, which justifies God keeping them in hell. But that's like special needs. But I'll still address it, So whatever. Anyways, these are the arguments that I think are pretty strong. The other arguments that I was going to do was one on original sin, and then I have another one too, which I'm going to write probably tomorrow, which deals with, which centers more on that problem of value correspondence I mentioned earlier. But yeah, so I think those are two arguments that deconstruct the status argument in particular, but also kind of push back against the infernalist position, the position that affirms the eternality of eternal conscious torment, and at least leads the person to annihilationism or universalism. So go ahead and subscribe down below for more videos that are very philosophical like this, as I enjoy writing these types of arguments. I think they're very fun. I think you get more out of them than I think just like throwing down words on a piece of paper. Creating these arguments that have entailments and conclusions are actually really fulfilling. So I'll probably do this in the future more, but yeah, have a good day, like the video.